The deserted streets of Havenwood, a small town in the heart of Montana, told stories of a life that no longer existed. The broken shop windows reflected the pale light of a tired-looking sun, while the wind blew through the corners, carrying the distant sound of moans that chilled the bones. There, the world as it was known had come to an end. The zombie apocalypse had started as an unknown disease, something that seemed too small to shake humanity. Within weeks, chaos spread. It was transmitted through blood, through the bite of someone infected. The hospitals filled up, then the streets, and finally, silence took over everything. What remained were only the survivors, wandering like ghosts in search of hope. Michael Reed, an ordinary man with tired eyes, drove his truck down a desolate road. In the passenger seat, his wife, Laura, held little Emma, their 1-year-old daughter. The baby slept peacefully, oblivious to the world that was collapsing around her. Laura looked at the child as if every second with her was a precious gift. "Do you think we'll still find food around here?" Laura asked, her voice low, almost a whisper, as if she was afraid of attracting something by speaking too loudly. Michael gripped the steering wheel. "We have to try. I can't let Emma go hungry." They had been driving for days, stopping only to rest or scavenge for supplies. Fuel was running out, as was hope. When they saw an old market on the side of the road, they decided to take a chance. Michael went down first, knife in hand, eyes alert for any movement. "Stay in the car with Emma," he asked, but Laura shook her head. "I'll go with you. We can't waste time." Inside the market, the air was thick, smelling of mold and rotting meat. Knocked-down shelves and debris littered the floor. Michael rummaged through the cans of food, while Laura moved cautiously down the adjacent aisle. The silence was piercing, until the sound of something being dragged across the floor made them both freeze. "Michael!" Laura called, but it was too late. A figure stepped out of the shadows, eyes milky and mouth open in a grotesque snarl. Michael reacted quickly, pushing the zombie against a wall and plunging the knife into its head. "Everything is fine," he said breathlessly, but when he turned to Laura, his world stopped. She was leaning against a shelf, holding her arm. Blood oozed between his fingers. Michael ran to her, and when he saw the bite on her skin, despair hit him like a blow. "No, no, no," he repeated, as if words could undo the inevitable. Laura looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but not afraid. "Michael, we don't have time. Take Emma and go." "I won't leave you," he replied, voice shaking. She cupped his face with her hand that was still steady. "You are going, for her. Promise, Michael. Don't let this be in vain." Michael refused to leave his wife. He just couldn't do it. He helped Laura into the truck while carefully holding Emma. He looked at her arm, where the bite was now a grotesque, swollen, dark wound. With every minute that passed, it seemed like the virus was spreading faster. "Hold on tight, Laura. I'll find help," he said, but his voice sounded so uncertain, he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. Laura, pale and in a cold sweat, looked at him with a faint smile. "Michael, you know what happens to everyone who gets bit?" "No, not you. I won't let that happen," he replied, pulling the car toward the main road. Michael drove without stopping, his eyes attentive to the road and the map, looking for some sign of hope. They had heard about a makeshift clinic for survivors about 20 miles away. If there was a doctor, maybe there would still be time. But Laura's body was starting to fail. She was breathing hard, her eyes losing their shine, and Michael knew he was running out of options. When they reached an isolated area, the silence inside the car was broken by a sound he hadn't expected, a low, guttural growl. Michael turned to see Laura, but she was no longer the same. His face was contorted, his eyes turned milky, and his mouth opened in an animalistic snarl. "Laura!" he shouted, trying to reach her, but she no longer recognized him. Her arms shot forward to grab him, teeth seeking flesh. Michael instinctively pulled the steering wheel, and the truck skidded violently. The sound of crumpled metal and broken glass was followed by terrifying silence. Michael tasted blood in his mouth as he opened his eyes, dazed. Emma was crying in the back seat, but she was unharmed thanks to the makeshift seatbelt he had made. Laura, however, was not so lucky. The impact of the accident threw her against the dashboard, and her body was now motionless. Michael swallowed hard, fighting back tears as he got out of the car. He knew Laura was already gone, but the emptiness in his chest was unbearable. Upon exiting the vehicle, he noticed something even worse. A small cut on his arm. He touched the wound with trembling fingers and saw the blood. It was then that he realized that in the middle of the fight, Laura had bitten him. Michael fell to his knees, breathing heavily. He knew what that meant. He had little time, maybe 48 hours, before he lost control. He looked at Emma, who was watching him from the back seat with innocent eyes. "I won't leave you alone," he muttered to himself, standing up with difficulty. He knew he needed to find someone who could take care of her before it was too late. Michael knew time was against him. The bite on his arm, small but fatal, was beginning to burn, a growing pain that could not be ignored. He looked at Emma, still inside the car, her eyes curious and innocent. He needed to find help before it was too late, and the hospital was a few miles away. With shaking hands, Michael picked up an old backpack and adjusted it on his back. Inside her he placed Emma with extreme care, tying her in an improvised but firm way. She seemed strangely calm, as if she knew her father was doing everything he could to keep her safe. The weight of her daughter on her back, however, seemed almost unbearable. It wasn't just the physical weight, but the weight of an immense responsibility, a promise he knew he couldn't fulfill alone. "I'll protect you, Emma. I'll get you out of this hell," he muttered to himself, feeling a surge of pain in his chest. The memory of Laura, his wife, still fresh in his mind. The image of her before she died, trying to bite into his flesh, trying to destroy everything he loved most. With a heavy sigh, Michael began walking, each step more difficult than the last. The uneven terrain of the deserted road seemed to go on forever, and the surrounding landscape was a picture of desolation. Withered trees, abandoned houses, and the wind that blew with a bitter cold. The silence was oppressive, as if the world was waiting for him to fall. As he walked, the pain in his arm intensified. It was as if something was spreading inside his body, stealing his strength with every step. But he couldn't stop. Emma needed him. He clenched his teeth, ignoring the discomfort, focused on the only objective left, getting to the hospital. When he finally arrived at the hospital, his heart sank. The building was silent, but not that comforting silence of an abandoned place. It was the silence of a place that was once full of life, now transformed into a tomb. He entered through the main door, footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The reception was destroyed, the furniture was broken, and the walls were marked by time and neglect. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Michael screamed, but the only response was the sound of his own voice trailing off into the void. He walked down the halls, passing empty rooms, abandoned gurneys, and overturned closets. Nothing. There was no one to help. The hospital was empty, but contrary to what Michael feared, there was something there that could still be useful. At the back of the building, in a supply room that seemed to have been forgotten, he found what was left of a world that no longer existed. Cans of food, medicines, ropes, and even a first aid kit still intact. With shaking hands, he picked up as much as he could carry. Cans of food with simple but essential labels. The medicines, which could be useful, perhaps even save his own life, if the transformation started to advance faster than he imagined. The first aid kit, containing the basics to stop injuries and perhaps even alleviate the growing pain he felt in his arm. He knew that the hospital was no longer a safe place, so he decided to leave and seek refuge somewhere further away, where he might be less likely to encounter other infected people. The forest seemed the only viable shelter. With Emma still strapped to his back, he began walking deeper into the forest. Every step he took him further than he knew, but also took him away from immediate danger. The tension in the air was palpable, and Michael knew he couldn't afford to relax. Fear and pain, now a constant in his body, were present in every movement he made. When he reached a small clearing in the forest, he knelt down, carefully lifting Emma off his back. The baby was restless, and Michael had known she needed to feed. He opened a can of food and, with shaking hands, fed his daughter. His eyes fixed on her, a mix of desperation and unconditional love. He still didn't know how to save his daughter, but he couldn't let her suffer. She was all that was left. Sitting there, watching the leaves move in the wind and listening to the distant sounds of animals in the forest, Michael tried to process everything that had happened. The pain of losing Laura, the fear of the approaching transformation, and the constant feeling that time was running out. It was then that a distant noise broke the silence of the forest. Michael stopped, his muscles tense, his senses heightened. He knew something was wrong. The sound was coming from somewhere in the shadows of the trees. It was a low crack, like the sound of stealthy footsteps on dry earth. He was not alone. "Still," said a voice from the shadows, cutting through the silence of the forest with a coldness that made Michael's spine stretch. He didn't know who was there, but he felt the weight of the gun on the back of his neck, like a promise of danger. The crack of the gun being aimed was clear, the tension in the air so thick he could barely breathe. He raised his hands slowly, trying to remain calm. "I'm just passing through," Michael said, his voice firmer than he felt. "I won't get in the way." The voice that responded was direct and incisive. "What are you doing here?" Michael turned his head toward the voice, but he couldn't see anything beyond the shadows and the movement of the trees. He tried to maintain his composure, but his heart was pounding, knowing that any wrong move could be the end. I came to bring my wife to the hospital," he said, the pain at the memory of Laura almost unbearable. "But we had an accident. She ended up passing away. I left the road because there were a lot of zombies there, but I'm leaving now." The young woman who appeared from the shadows was an imposing figure, with a firm posture and a suspicious look. Her black hair fell in a cascade, like a curtain of night, and her skin, a deep olive tone, reflected the moonlight in an almost supernatural way. She had the strong, lithe physique of someone accustomed to the wild, with toned muscles and a presence that radiated relentless confidence. Her expression was impassive, as if she was constantly ready to face any threat that came her way. Kaya, the young indigenous woman, did not let her guard down. The world had changed, and people were no longer trustworthy. She knew she could be facing an armed man, waiting for the right moment to attack her. Life in the post-apocalypse required constant vigilance. Michael didn't seem like an immediate threat, but she couldn't risk it. Your eyes were alert, scanning his every move, every possible hidden weapon. She looked around, taking in the silence that stretched across the forest. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, his gaze was caught by a small movement to his right. She saw a child, a baby, wrapped in a blanket in the corner of the clearing. The small body, so fragile, seemed to be asleep, but something in the child's eyes made her hesitate. It was pure innocence, something Kaya hadn't seen in a long time. The young woman approached slowly, still with the gun in her hands, but now the tension in her body seemed to ease a little. She observed the girl, who was quiet, with big, curious eyes, observing everything around her. Kaya felt a mix of emotions as she looked at the child. She didn't know what she thought about Michael yet, but the baby seemed so vulnerable, so dependent. It was difficult to imagine that anyone could be a threat, having something so fragile to protect. Are you with her?" Kaya asked, voice softened but still cautious. "Yes," he replied, with sadness in his voice. "She is my daughter." Kaya, still holding the gun steady, looked at Michael, her expression uncompromising. The weight of distrust hung in the air, but there was something in Michael's eyes that began to soften his rigid stance. She had heard the crash on the road, the accident. That wasn't a lie. She took a step forward, without taking her eyes off Michael, and pointed the gun at the backpack on his back. "Throw the backpack on the floor," he ordered. Michael didn't hesitate. With shaking hands, he took the backpack off his back and threw it to the ground with a slight pop. The sound of the backpack falling seemed deafening in that tense silence. Kaya approached, with the gun still drawn, but her posture a little more relaxed. She began rummaging through her backpack with calculated speed, pulling out the items and inspecting them one by one. First, a bottle of water, then some cans of food, medicine, a pack of bandages, and finally, a first aid kit. No weapons, nothing that could be a threat. Kaya looked at the medicine, the cans of food, and then Michael's eyes. Something in his expression began to change. She could see he was telling the truth. He was not armed, nor was he a threat. "That's all I have," Michael continued, pointing to the backpack. "Food, medicine, some things I found along the way. I wanted to help if you need anything." Kaya looked at him, sizing him up once more. Finally, she lowered the gun. Are you really alone?" "Yes," replied Michael with a sigh of relief. "I have no one else, only her." Kaya looked at Emma, who was quiet, watching them with her big, innocent eyes. She seemed like a normal child, but Kaya knew that normal no longer existed. She lowered the gun completely, and for the first time since finding him, there was a slight softness in her eyes. "I will accept your food," Kaya said, voice now calmer. "But don't expect me to trust completely. The world has changed. People have changed." In addition to food, there was something even more precious to Kaya: antibiotics. She knew that the medicine wouldn't save her father from the transformation, but she had to try. Kaya told Michael that her father had been bitten a day ago by zombies that had invaded their campsite during the night. His elderly and weak father was sleeping when it happened. He let out a scream, but it was too late. He had already been injured. "Let's go," she said, already starting to walk towards the deeper forest. "I will take you to my house. There, you can rest with your daughter, and I will give these medicines to my father." Arriving at the camp, Kaya guided Michael to a small clearing where a simple tent was pitched. The place was rustic, but it seemed to be a makeshift shelter for her and her father. When the tent was opened, Michael was met with a sight that made him catch his breath. The man, elderly and tired-looking, was lying on a makeshift mattress. His skin was pale and exhausted, his eyes dull, but still with a spark of consciousness that made his gaze seem distant and disturbing. Kaya approached him carefully, a serious and dark expression on her face. She removed a small box of medicine from her backpack and with silent precision began giving injections to her father's arm. With each injection, the man's body seemed to react in an unsettling way, as if it were fighting the impending transformation. The tension was palpable. The smell of desperation hung in the air. Michael stood still, observing everything in silence, his heart squeezed by the situation. He knew what was about to happen, but still, he couldn't help but feel a pang of compassion for Kaya's suffering. "Father," Kaya spoke, her voice shaky but firm. "This is Michael. He has a daughter. He brought you some medicine." The old man, with difficulty, raised his eyes to Michael. His once vivid eyes were now cloudy and almost expressionless, completely overwhelmed by the transformation. His skin, pale and wrinkled, seemed to have been stripped of all vitality. He was in an advanced stage of transformation. It was evident that he was approaching the end, and that in just a few hours he would lose the remainder of his humanity. Michael felt the weight of the situation. Although he knew what was happening to Kaya's father, there was something even more disturbing that afflicted him: the growing pain in his own body. His wound was deeper than he cared to admit, and what were once just subtle signs now became sharp, uncontrollable pains. He felt the fever beginning to take over his body, and the weight of his own transformation approaching. He knew he couldn't hide that he had been bitten much longer, but at that moment, words didn't seem necessary. Both were facing the same dark fate. Without another word, the two left the cabin, taking what they could. Kaya took what was left of the supplies, and with a silent gesture indicated that Michael should set up camp. Michael settled down on the floor, with Emma still in his arms, and watched the growing darkness around them. Night was coming, and with it the deep silence of the forest. The crackling of the fire was the only thing that could be heard. Suddenly, the silence of the night was broken by a loud, guttural growl, a distorted, animalistic sound that came from inside the cabin. Michael felt his stomach drop as he recognized where it came from. It was Kaya's father, now completely transformed. Michael held Emma against his chest, the child still unconscious in his arms, not understanding what was happening, but feeling the tension building in the air. He knew the worst was about to happen. Kaya, with an expression that mixed despair and determination, immediately jumped into the hut. She didn't think twice. "Dad, stop it!" she screamed, her voice filled with pain, as if there was still a chance to bring humanity back to this man, but he didn't recognize her. Kaya's father advanced, his mouth open, revealing sharp teeth and an insatiable hunger. He tried to bite his own daughter, but Kaya, with a heavy heart, had no choice but to push him away. The old man fell to the ground, but his agitation did not cease. He stood up, more aggressive, more desperate. "Father, it's me! Kaya! Your daughter, stop!" she pleaded, her words drowned out by the sound of the man's heavy breathing. But he didn't stop. He threw himself at her again, with a primal instinct that made her understand that the person she knew was no longer there. There was no more father. There was no more humanity. With a choked cry of anguish, Kaya had no other choice. In a quick and precise movement, she held the knife in both hands and with a sigh of despair, plunged it into her father's head. The sound of impact was muffled by the man's grunt, and he fell backwards. Kaya fell to her knees beside her father's body, tears mixing with the dirt on his face. The pain in my chest was unbearable. She had done what she needed to do, but the cost was too high. Michael came up with the idea of preparing a divine funeral for Kaya's father. In silence, Kaya and Michael prepared the grave in the forest. The soil was damp and the earth was cold, making work difficult. With Michael's help, Kaya placed her father's body there, the weight of loss making each movement heavier. Tears ran down Kaya's face, but no one said anything. Michael knew she needed time to process everything. Without another word, he walked away and went to his camp. Kaya stood there, alone, in front of what was left of her family, absorbing the pain and reality of what had happened. In his tent, Michael reflected on what had happened. The weight of the bite on his body was becoming clearer and clearer, and he knew that time was running out. He decided that the next morning he would tell Kaya the truth. He had also been bitten. He didn't want to end up like her father, attacking those he had promised to protect. His goal now was to help Kaya, to make sure she had the resources and support she needed to care for Emma when he was no longer there. The next morning, Michael approached Kaya, who was preparing food around the fire. She seemed immersed in what she was doing, but his presence was enough to break the silence. "Kaya, we need to talk," Michael said, his voice deep. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her gaze intent. "What happened, Michael?" He hesitated, the weight of the revelation making words difficult. "There's something I didn't tell you. Something that happened that night in the car accident." Kaya frowned but waited. Michael took a deep breath, the sound of smoke from the campfire the only noise for a moment. "I was bitten. My wife, Laura, she bit me before she passed away. I didn't tell you that because I didn't want to worry you, but now I can't hide it anymore." Kaya looked at him without immediate reaction, her eyes fixed on him. "So you are infected?" Michael nodded, the weight of confirmation in his eyes. "Yes, I know what that means, Kaya, and I don't want to end up like her. I don't want to be a threat to you or Emma." Silence hung between them, heavy, as Kaya processed what she had just heard. She didn't look away from him, but her expression was difficult to read. "And what do you intend to do now?" she asked, her voice tense but calm. "I'll stay until the last moment," Michael said. "I want to help you take care of Emma, until I can't anymore. I want to make sure you two have a chance." Kaya remained silent, staring into the fire, while Michael waited for an answer. "There's a tribe nearby. I can take Emma there. They can help us." Michael watched her, his eyes steady. "I'll make sure you two get there safely." Kaya hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "We don't have time to waste. Let's go." Michael and Kaya quickly moved into the forest, with Emma in their arms and the few supplies they could gather strapped into makeshift backpacks. The dense, humid forest seemed to swallow every step, but the sound of the leaves being trampled was muffled by the weight of the urgency they carried. The path was tortuous, full of exposed roots and broken branches, but there was no time to hesitate. Emma's future was in Kaya's hands, and Michael's fate was increasingly clear. As they advanced, Michael felt the transformation taking over his body. His skin, already marked by wear, was increasingly pale and wrinkled, as if he was being consumed from within. The pain that was beginning to emerge was intense, but he forced every muscle to continue. "I couldn't stop." Each breath felt more difficult, as if the air was becoming thinner, and his body began to react strangely, with an increasing stiffness in his movements. The pace of the walk became increasingly difficult for Michael. His steps, once firm, were now more faltering, and his breathing became heavy and irregular. The heat of the transformation consumed him from within, every cell in his body seeming to scream for relief, but he forced himself to press on. The pain was unbearable, but he knew he couldn't stop. Not now. But finally the body couldn't take it anymore. In an abrupt movement, Michael fell to his knees on the floor, the weight of pain finally bringing him down. He hunched over, his hands pressing against the ground, trying to maintain control. Kaya stopped immediately, her worried gaze turning to him. Michael felt sweat running down his forehead, his body shaking with the intensity of the transformation. The fear of losing control paralyzed him for a moment. "I'm still conscious," he said shakily, his voice hoarse and low. "I just need a break." Kaya approached quickly, panic taking over her gaze, but she stood her ground. Michael breathed heavily, trying to catch his breath. He knew that what was happening to him was inevitable, but he still felt a deep anguish at the thought of what he could do to them. He looked at the ropes they had brought with them, and, with forced determination, began tying his own hands behind his back. The pain in his skin was almost unbearable, but he continued. The idea of losing control and putting them both at risk was even more terrifying. When he finished, he looked at Kaya, his eyes filled with a fear he couldn't hide. "Please," he begged, voice shaking, "tape my mouth. I can't lose control." Kaya hesitated for a moment, fear clear in her eyes, but she knew it was necessary. With controlled speed, she took the tape and applied it to her mouth, securing it firmly. Michael closed his eyes as his mind drifted away from reality. He forced himself to breathe slowly, feeling the ropes tightening his hands, and yet the internal struggle was immense. The path seemed endless, but he couldn't stop. Each step was a monumental effort, his legs shaking with the weight of exhaustion. He didn't look back, but the weight of what was to come crushed him inside. He knew that at any moment he could lose control, but for now he was still there. He still had them. And that was all that mattered. Kaya, with silent determination, took Emma into her arms and adjusted the girl against her chest. The weight of the backpacks now fell on Michael, who was fighting the growing pain that consumed him. Every step felt like an unbearable challenge. His skin was increasingly cold and pale, and tiredness enveloped him like a thick fog. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let the grief overcome him, not while Emma still needed him. Kaya led the way, the sound of her nimble footsteps breaking the silence of the forest. She knew Michael's end was near, time running out every moment. The fear of losing the man who, despite the imminent transformation, was still there to help them, weighed heavily on her heart. She didn't look back, but the tightness in her chest didn't ease. She knew that soon Michael would no longer be able to follow, but until then, she needed to ensure that the two of them arrived safely at the Indian camp. Wasting no time, she grabbed all the weapons and kept them with her, aware that they would be needed to protect both her and Emma on the way. She couldn't trust anything else in that desolate world. With each step, the weight of the situation increased, but she stood firm. Michael's confidence, though visibly weakened by the transformation, was a beacon she couldn't ignore. Michael, in turn, used what little consciousness he had left to focus on Emma. His thoughts were in turmoil, but there was only one thing clear in his mind. He needed to get her to the indigenous camp. He knew this was the only place she would have a chance to grow, to live, away from the imminent danger he now represented. With each painful step, the sight of her daughter safely back at camp became her only goal. The pain in his body and the growing sense of control slipping away were nothing compared to what he felt as he imagined what could happen to Emma if he lost his internal struggle. She was all he had left. She was his reason to keep going, even when his body and mind began to fail him. The forest seemed to swallow the sounds around it, and time dragged on. Michael, even with the last vestiges of lucidity, knew he couldn't last much longer. But as long as he could, he would do whatever he could to make sure his daughter had a chance. Kaya and Emma reached the tribe safely, the arduous and dangerous path finally coming to an end. But as soon as they crossed the borders of the Indian camp, Michael couldn't take it anymore. He fell to his knees on the ground, his bones cracking as if they were breaking, and a guttural scream escaped his throat, a reflection of the pain consuming him. His body contorted violently, veins pulsing in his pale, wrinkled skin, clear signs that the transformation was finally taking hold. Kaya, terrified, saw the scene before her and froze for a moment. Emma, who was in his arms, started crying when she saw her father like that. The sound of the girl's cry seemed to echo in the vastness of the forest, mixing with Michael's desperate scream, who fought what was happening to him. He tried to control himself, but the pain was unbearable, and his conscience was becoming farther and farther. The indigenous, attentive and vigilant, began to approach, observing the scene with caution. They knew what was happening, recognized the signs of transformation, and were ready to act if there was any threat. Michael's transformation was quick and brutal. He no longer had traces of humanity left in his eyes. Its grunts became increasingly guttural and distorted. Emma cried desperately, the shouts of the little one echoing through the village as her father twisted on the floor. Kaya looked at him with a deep pain in his heart. He knew that the man who had helped her, who had guided her there with so much courage, was now hopelessly transformed. That Michael, who had sacrificed for them, no longer existed. The indigenous people in silence took their precautions. Quickly, they pulled Kaya and Emma into the village, with the care and speed of those who already knew the severity of the situation. Michael was out there, a spectrum of what he was: empty eyes, without any other human countenance. He was lost forever. Kaya, with a heavy heart, knew Michael had fulfilled her mission. He brought them there, guaranteed their security, even though he knew his end was near. He had been fundamental. Without him, she and Emma would not be there now, with a chance of survival. As the village's doors closed, she last looked out, where Michael now became a distant shadow, a memory of what she had lost, but also what she still had, a chance of life. She walked away, but his image, Michael's courage and sacrifice, would stay with her forever. If you liked this story, don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Here, you will find exciting stories every day, made to touch the heart. And I'm sure the story that is appearing on the screen now will thrill you too. Don't miss it.